The first time Susan told me I was not really family, I was sitting at her dining room table with both hands wrapped around a glass of water I had not touched. I was 19, 3 months pregnant, and Ryan sat beside me like the decision had already been made without me. His father stood by the kitchen window. His sister kept looking at my stomach like it was evidence. Susan folded her napkin, smiled without warmth, and said, "Girls like you don't get choices handed to them, Emily. You get rescued, and then you behave." That was the first time I understood what my marriage was going to cost me. I had no father alive to stand up and ask her who she thought she was. I had no money, no house, no college degree, and no last name in that town that made people lower their voices. I had my mother, who was already ashamed and scared, and I had Ryan, who squeezed my knee under the table as if that should count as protection. It did not. Susan said they would do the right thing. She said Ryan would marry me before I started showing. She said their family had an empty rental house near the store, and if I was grateful, my daughter would be born under a decent roof instead of in the kind of chaos girls like me usually created. Ryan did not correct her. He only leaned close and whispered that I should let his mother talk, that fighting her would make everything harder. I believed him because I still loved him then, and because I was young enough to confuse control with strength. What they did not know was that the house they used to make me feel small had a history they had buried better than they had buried their shame. My name is Emily, and for years, I let that family tell everyone I was a mistake they were kind enough to manage. I let them call their control help. I let them call my silence respect. I even let them convince me that losing myself was the price of keeping my daughter safe. They thought I had nothing. That was their first mistake. Ryan had been charming in the beginning, the kind of quiet man people trusted because he never raised his voice in public. His family owned a small Japanese market in southern Oregon, the kind with clean windows, polite customers, imported snacks, handmade signs, and a reputation that made people treat them like they were better than everyone else. He was the middle son, responsible enough to impress older people and handsome enough to make me forget to be careful. He told me once, outside a summer street fair, that he had wanted to ask me out for months but thought I would laugh at him. I thought that was sweet. Looking back, I think Ryan had learned early that sounding humble was useful. For the first few months, he made me feel chosen. Then he started correcting little things. What I wore, which friends stayed too late, how loud I laughed, why I had to text him when I got home from work, if he already knew my shift ended at 6. At first, each correction came wrapped in concern, and concern is hard to fight when you want to be loved. By the time I was pregnant, his voice could change the temperature of a room. After the wedding, Susan handed me the house key in front of everyone, but she did not put it in my palm. She placed it on the table, between us, like a contract. She said, "This home belongs to our family, Emily. Remember that when you start feeling independent." I smiled because Ava was kicking inside me, and I had already learned that if I reacted, Ryan would call me dramatic later. The house was small, white, and close enough to the market that Susan could stop by whenever she wanted. She said it was convenient. It felt like a window with no curtains. I could not buy dish soap without her knowing. I could not visit my mother without Ryan asking why I needed to be away from home so often. I could not breathe without feeling like I owed someone an explanation. Then Ava was born on a rainy Thursday morning, and for one clean minute, everything else disappeared. She came out furious, red-faced, and perfect. Ryan cried when he held her, and I remember thinking maybe fatherhood would soften him. Maybe being responsible for something that innocent would make him less interested in controlling everything around him. For a while, it almost did. He worked long days at the market. I stayed home with Ava. Susan brought groceries, diapers, advice, criticism, and little comments that left marks no one else could see. She would look around my kitchen and say, "Ryan works too hard for this place to look tired." She would pick Ava up and murmur, "Grandma will make sure you grow up properly." Every sentence had a handle on it. When Ava turned 3, Ryan came home one evening with a stack of papers and a face that told me I was about to be informed, not asked. He said the family had an opportunity in Japan. A distributor near Nagoya needed someone bilingual enough and trustworthy enough to handle warehouse contracts for a year, maybe 2. His uncle had arranged it. The money would be better than anything he could make at the store. I asked when we were leaving. Ryan looked at me like I had misunderstood my position in my own life. He said, "You and Ava are staying here. My mother will handle the money." That sentence landed harder than the announcement itself. I told him I did not want to be alone. I told him Ava needed her father. I told him I did not want Susan handling every grocery receipt and every doctor bill like I was one more employee of their family. Ryan listened quietly, the way he always did before deciding my feelings were background noise. Then he said, "I'm doing this for our future, Emily. Don't turn my sacrifice into another one of your problems." 2 weeks later, he was gone. At first, I tried to be the kind of wife everyone expected. I sent pictures of Ava. I answered late calls even when the connection lagged and his voice came through flat and tired. I let Susan bring envelopes of cash and ask what I had spent the last one on. I let her stand in my doorway and inspect the living room like a landlord with a grudge. But distance did something I had not expected. It let me hear my own thoughts again. Without Ryan in the house, I stopped bracing before I opened a cabinet. I let Ava paint at the kitchen table and did not panic when blue streaks got on the wood. I walked to the park without asking if it was a good time. I laughed with my mother on the phone without lowering my voice when I heard a car outside. Freedom came quietly at first, almost like guilt. Susan noticed before I admitted it to myself. One Saturday morning, I took Ava to a pancake breakfast at the community center. I wore jeans, a yellow sweater, and lipstick for the first time in months. It was not much. It was enough. Susan found me near the coffee urn and looked at my mouth before she looked at my eyes. She said, "That's a bold color for a married woman whose husband is overseas." 2 women from her church turned toward us. I felt my face go hot. I said it was just lipstick. Susan smiled and said, "That's how it starts. First lipstick, then a job, then shame." Ava tugged my sleeve, asking for syrup, and I swallowed every word I wanted to say. That afternoon, Susan called Ryan. That night, Ryan called me and asked why his mother had to hear from other people that I was acting single. I stood in the hallway while Ava slept and tried to explain lipstick to a man 6,000 miles away. He said, "You're comfortable because my money is feeding you. Don't forget that." I did not sleep much after that. By the end of the 2nd year, Ryan still had not come home. Every plan had a new reason attached to it. The contract was extended. The exchange rate was favorable. His uncle needed him another season. The market back home would benefit if he stayed. He talked about sacrifice, but the sacrifices were always mine. So I did the first thing he had told me not to do. I found a job. It was part-time at a title office downtown, filing records, answering phones, scanning old property documents, and making coffee for people who spoke in legal descriptions. I did not take the job because I was trying to prove anything at first. I took it because I needed money that did not pass through Susan's hands before it reached mine. I arranged childcare with my sister before I told Susan. When I finally said it, she did not blink. She put her purse on my counter and said, "Ryan said no." I told her Ryan was not here. Her expression changed so quickly that Ava stopped coloring and looked up. Susan stepped closer and lowered her voice. "This family gave you a home, a name, and a chance to raise your child properly. Do not mistake loneliness for permission." That should have scared me enough to quit. Instead, I went to work on Monday. The office smelled like toner, old paper, and burnt coffee. My manager, Carol, was blunt but fair. She did not know Susan well, which made her feel safe. The first paycheck had my name on it, and I sat in my car staring at it for almost 10 minutes, ashamed of how emotional I felt over money that could barely cover groceries. That was where I met Cole. He worked as a closing assistant, quiet, patient, with sleeves always rolled to his elbows and a way of listening that made people say more than they planned. He did not flirt with me at first. That might be why I noticed him. In a town where most people treated me like Ryan's absent wife or Susan's poor daughter-in-law, Cole treated me like a person standing in front of him. The first time Susan saw me talking to him, she was across the street outside the pharmacy. She did not wave. That evening, Ryan called before I had even started dinner. He asked who the man was, not what the job was like, not how Ava was doing, not whether I was tired. Who the man was. I told him Cole worked at the office. Ryan said my voice sounded defensive. I said his question sounded insulting. He went quiet, and that quiet had trained me for years. Then he said, "A woman in your position should be careful how she looks to people." My position. He always knew which words would put me back in my place. For a while, I tried to keep everything clean. I kept my conversations with Cole short. I stopped wearing lipstick. I made sure I left work exactly when my shift ended. But Susan had already found a new weapon. She started showing up at the office with Ava, pretending she was doing me favors. She would call me loudly from the front desk and say, "Your daughter wanted to see where mommy goes when daddy's gone." Carol noticed. Cole noticed too. One afternoon, after Susan left, he found me in the file room with my hands shaking over a stack of deed books. He asked if I was okay. I said yes too fast. He did not push. He just picked up half the stack and said, "Then I'll help you be okay faster." I laughed, and the sound startled me. That was the problem. With Cole, I remembered parts of myself Ryan had trained me to pack away. It did not happen all at once. People like to think betrayal begins with a kiss, but sometimes it begins with being heard at the exact moment you have forgotten what that feels like. Cole started walking me to my car. Then he started waiting when Susan's SUV was in the lot. Then one night, after Ryan called me ungrateful and hung up while I was still crying, I sat in my car behind the office and Cole tapped on the window. I should have driven away. I did not. He got in on the passenger side and said, "You don't have to tell me anything. Just don't sit here alone if you're scared." I told him I was not scared. My voice broke on the last word. He touched my hand, and I let him. That was the line I crossed first. I will not pretend I was innocent after that. I was lonely, angry, tired of being watched, and weak in a way I had judged other women for before I became one of them. Cole told me he cared about me. I told him I was married. He said being abandoned and controlled was not the same as being loved. I told him that did not make it right. Then I kissed him anyway. For 3 months, I lived 2 lives, and both of them were closing in. At home, Susan became sharper. She checked Ava's backpack, asked where I had bought her socks, counted the hours between work and pickup. On the phone, Ryan grew colder. He said his mother was worried about my judgment. He said Ava needed stability. He said courts did not look kindly on mothers who acted reckless. He had never mentioned courts before. At work, Cole started asking what I wanted. Not what I was afraid of. What I wanted. I did not know how to answer that without destroying everything. Then the first photo arrived. It came in a plain envelope slid under my front door. Inside was a blurry picture of me and Cole sitting in his truck outside the office after closing. We were not kissing in it, but his hand was on my wrist, and anyone who wanted to make it ugly could. There was a note folded behind it. Ask your boyfriend if he can raise your daughter too. No signature. I knew Susan before I reached the second line. I called Cole from the bathroom with the shower running so Ava would not hear my voice. He told me to bring the envelope to work and not say anything to Susan yet. He sounded angry, but under the anger was fear. and that scared me more than the note. The next morning, Susan was waiting in my kitchen. She had a key. Of course she had a key. The envelope sat on the table between us. Ava was in her pajamas, holding her cereal bowl, eyes moving from one adult to the other. Susan said, "I told Ryan a job would turn you into exactly what you came from." I told Ava to go brush her teeth. Susan told her to stay. That was the first time I pushed back with my whole voice. I said, "Do not use my daughter as an audience." Susan smiled like she had been waiting for that. "Your daughter deserves to know what kind of woman her mother is." I reached for the envelope. Susan slapped her hand down on it first. Then she said the sentence that burned through whatever shame I still had left. "You were a charity case before my son touched you, Emily. Don't make us prove it in court." Ava started crying. I moved toward her, but Susan stepped between us as if she had any right. She said Ryan wanted Ava at her house for a few days until things calmed down. I said no. Susan told me she had already spoken to him, and if I made a scene, everyone would know why. I thought that was the threat. I was wrong. By noon, my mother had called, crying. By 2, Carol had closed her office door and asked if there was anything I needed to tell her. By 5, 2 women at the grocery store turned their carts around when they saw me. Susan had not just told Ryan. She had told the town, carefully, selectively, with enough truth to make every lie believable. That night, Ryan called. He did not yell at first. That made it worse. His voice was low and steady when he said he had seen the photo. He said his mother had warned him from the beginning. He said he had worked himself half to death in Japan, while I embarrassed him in the town that respected his family. I tried to say I was sorry. I tried to say he had left me alone for years. I tried to say loneliness did not excuse me, but it explained something. Ryan cut me off. "You don't get to explain sin with loneliness," he said. "You get to beg me not to take Ava." I sat down on the hallway floor because my knees stopped trusting me. He told me to quit the job. He told me to stop speaking to Cole. He told me Susan would take Ava to her house whenever she decided I needed supervision. He told me if I fought him, he would come home with every receipt, every witness, every photograph, and every person in town who knew I was unstable. Then he said, "Remember whose roof you're under." I looked up at the ceiling of that little white house and felt something move through me that was not fear anymore. It was recognition. The next morning, I went to the title office to resign because I did not know what else to do. Cole met me outside before I reached the door. He had not shaved. He looked like he had spent the night pacing. He said, "Don't quit because they're blackmailing you." I told him he did not understand. I told him they were going to take Ava. I told him I had given them the knife, and now they were deciding how deep to push it. Cole reached into his truck and pulled out a folder. He said, "Then you need to know something before you hand them everything." Inside the folder was a copy of an old deed index from the county archive. He had been working through damaged records for a commercial refinance on the block where Ryan's family market sat. He said he was not snooping on me. He said he saw my father's name by accident because he knew it from my employee paperwork, and when he pulled the scanned file, the chain of title did not match what Susan always claimed. My father's name was on the original land contract. Not Ryan's father, not Susan, my father. I stared at the page until the words stopped behaving like words. Cole said there had been a private lease agreement years ago between my father and Ryan's father. The market building and the little white house had been part of the same parcel back then, before the town split the addresses for tax purposes. Ryan's family had operated on it for years, but the final transfer had never been recorded. There were notes about a trust. There were missing pages. There was enough smoke to mean there had been a fire somewhere. I told him that was impossible. My father had died with nothing. Cole looked at me carefully and said, "Maybe that's what somebody wanted you to believe." I took the folder home and hid it under Ava's winter clothes. For 2 days, I said nothing. Susan came by twice. once to take Ava for dinner, and once to remind me that Ryan expected written proof I had resigned. I gave her a printed resignation letter because I was still trapped, but I kept a copy of the deed index folded inside my purse. That tiny piece of paper changed the way I heard every insult. When Susan said I should be grateful for shelter, I looked at the baseboards and wondered who had paid for the land beneath them. When Ryan called and said his family would decide what happened next, I wrote down every threat with the date and time. When Susan told Ava that Grandma's house was calmer, I watched her mouth and finally saw panic hiding behind authority. They were not just punishing me. They were protecting something. Carol noticed I was not really leaving. She asked me to come in after hours and clean out my desk quietly, so no one made a scene. When I arrived, she locked the front door behind me and said there was someone in the conference room who wanted to speak with me. An older man stood when I walked in. He wore a brown jacket, carried a leather folder, and looked at me like he had known me when I was small. He introduced himself as Peter and said he had been my father's attorney before the cancer moved faster than the paperwork. I did not sit down. Peter said he had tried to contact my mother years ago, but the file had gone dormant after a dispute with Ryan's father. He said a trust had been created for me when I was 15, but some notices were returned, and then the records got buried in a storage transfer after his old firm closed. I asked him what trust. He opened the folder. The first page had my full legal name on it. The second had my father's signature. The third listed the Cedar Avenue parcel, the market building, the little white rental house, and a lease option that had expired 6 years earlier. My ears started ringing. Peter said, "Emily, your father did not leave you nothing." I gripped the back of the chair. He turned one more page and pushed it toward me. "He left you the land under their store, the house they put you in, and the right to collect every unpaid lease payment since the option expired." I thought of Susan placing that key on the table like I was being allowed to exist indoors. I thought of Ryan telling me to remember whose roof I was under. Peter lowered his voice and said, "There is one more thing. Ryan's father knew. He signed the original agreement." Outside the conference room, a car slowed near the front windows. Headlights washed across the blinds and disappeared. Peter closed the folder. "Do not tell them yet," he said, "because if they are already threatening your child, they are going to get much worse when they realize what is still in your name." For the first time in years, I understood that silence could be more than surrender. Sometimes silence was a door you locked from the inside. Peter told me not to tell them yet, so I did the hardest thing I had ever done. I went home and acted poor. Susan came by that evening with a casserole she had not made and a face that said my life had already been discussed without me. Ava was on the living room floor building a house out of cereal boxes. Susan stepped over it and said, "Ryan is coming home sooner than planned." My hand tightened around the sink. I asked when. She smiled and said, "Soon enough for you to start packing emotionally." I did not ask what that meant. She wanted me scared enough to make mistakes. So I nodded, thanked her for the food, and watched her eyes move across my kitchen, the same kitchen she believed belonged to her family. That was the first night I understood why Peter had warned me. People who build power on a lie do not panic loudly at first. They tighten the walls around you and hope you suffocate before you find the door. The next 2 weeks became a test of how much humiliation I could swallow without showing the weapon in my purse. Susan came every other day. Ryan called from Japan and asked if I had spoken to Cole, left the house, or signed the resignation letter. Then he said, "Good. You're finally remembering where you are." I wrote that sentence down too. Peter had told me to keep a log. Every threat, every visit, every time Susan tried to remove Ava, every time Ryan mentioned court, custody, money, reputation, or the house. By the end of the first week, that notebook felt heavier than any apology I could have made. Cole stayed away from the house, but he did not disappear. He left documents with Carol and sent copies through Peter. He found an old lease renewal Ryan's father had signed after my father died, tax notices redirected to Susan's brother's address, and checks made out to my father's estate, then endorsed by someone whose handwriting did not match my father's signature. The deeper Peter dug, the uglier it became. My father had not forgotten me. Someone had counted on a grieving widow, a teenage daughter, and a dead man's closed mouth. One afternoon, Peter placed two papers side by side. One was my father's real signature. The other was on a document that supposedly extended Ryan's family lease for 20 more years, at almost no rent. Peter tapped the second page and said, "This is the kind of mistake arrogant people make when they think nobody poor will ever hire a lawyer." That sentence stayed with me all the way home. Susan was waiting on my porch. Ava stood beside her with a pink backpack. I froze at the walkway. Susan said, "She's staying with me tonight. Ryan wants her settled before he arrives." I said no. Susan looked past me toward the street, where Mrs. Larkin from next door was pretending to water the same patch of grass for the third time that day. Then Susan raised her voice just enough. "Emily, we are trying to protect Ava from adult consequences. Please do not make this ugly in front of neighbors." I walked up the steps slowly and knelt in front of my daughter. I told her Grandma was not taking her anywhere unless Mommy said yes. Susan leaned close and whispered, "Fight me here, and I will call the sheriff. Then everyone will see what kind of mother you are." My fingers went cold. Then Mrs. Larkin turned off her hose and said from across the yard, "I can wait right here while Emily calls whoever she needs to call." Susan's head snapped toward her. For years, I thought everyone in that town believed Susan. Maybe some did, but that afternoon, I learned that watching is not always the same as agreeing. I took Ava inside and locked the door. Susan stood on the porch for a full minute, then knocked once with her knuckle, slow and hard. "This is going in my notes," she said. That was the moment my silence stopped feeling like fear and started feeling like a countdown. Ryan came home 3 nights later. He did not call first. I was rinsing a plate in the sink when headlights crossed the kitchen wall. Ava ran to the window and asked if Grandma was back. Before I answered, a car door closed, then another. I wiped my hands on a towel and saw Ryan walking up the path with one suitcase in his hand. Behind him was a woman I had never seen. She was beautiful in a quiet, careful way, with glossy black hair and a cream coat. She looked nervous, not cruel. That almost made it worse, because Ryan had not brought home a weapon that looked like a weapon. He had brought home replacement. Ava hid behind my leg when he stepped inside. Ryan looked around the room like he was checking for damage to property. 4 years overseas had made him sharper, leaner, more expensive looking, and more certain that admiration was something people owed him. He said, "This is Naomi." I waited for more. He added, "She'll be staying with my parents until everything is settled." Everything. That word sat in the room with us. Ryan crouched and opened his arms to our daughter. Ava stayed where she was. His face twitched with embarrassment, then hardened into blame. "She doesn't know me because you poisoned her against me," he said. I almost laughed from the shock of it. He had left when she was 3, but in his version, even his absence belonged to me. Ryan told Ava she was going to Grandma's house for the night. I said she was not. He smiled then, the same smile Susan used when witnesses were nearby. "You are in no position to deny me access to my child." I said, "You can visit her here." His eyes hardened. "This house is not yours." The sentence should have shaken me. Instead, I heard Peter's voice. "Do not tell them yet." So I lowered my eyes just enough to let Ryan believe he had won. I told him Ava was tired. He stepped closer, said he was done asking, and reached for Ava's wrist. She cried out before he even gripped it. Something in me broke clean. I put myself between them and said, "Touch her like that again, and I will call the police." Ryan stared at me like he had discovered a stranger in his kitchen. Then he said, "You think a judge is going to pick you over me?" I did not answer. He left with Naomi, but he left laughing. At the door, he turned back and said, "My attorney already filed. Enjoy your last few nights playing house." When the door closed, Ava started sobbing. I held her on the kitchen floor until her breathing slowed, and I stared at the cabinet where I had hidden copies of my father's trust. Ryan thought he had come home to take back his life. He had no idea he had walked onto land that had been waiting for my name. The temporary custody hearing was scheduled for the following Thursday. Ryan's attorney filed first, just like he promised. The petition painted me as unstable, adulterous, financially dependent, and unfit. It said I had no independent residence because the house belonged to Ryan's family, and that Susan had been Ava's stable caregiver while I chased a coworker. Reading it made me feel like I was being buried alive by words. Peter read every page without changing expression. Then he slid it back across the table and said, "They made one very useful mistake." I asked what. He said, "They claimed the house. That was the door." Peter filed an emergency response with Ryan's threats, my log, Mrs. Larkin's statement, and proof that I had been Ava's primary caregiver since Ryan left. Then, quietly, he filed a separate action regarding the property. He told me the custody hearing would be ugly before it got useful. He was right. The courthouse smelled like wet coats and old coffee. Susan arrived in a navy suit with pearls. Ryan wore a gray suit and brought Naomi with him. His father came too, smaller than I remembered, with tired eyes. When Ryan saw me with Peter, he looked amused. Susan leaned toward me outside the courtroom and said, "A cheap lawyer cannot wash a dirty woman clean." I looked at her pearls, then at the folder under Peter's arm. For the first time, I did not shrink. Inside, Ryan's attorney spoke first. He made my life sound like a bad habit. He said Ryan had sacrificed overseas while I behaved recklessly, and that I had no income, no property, and no moral standing to stop a responsible father from protecting his daughter. Moral standing. I wrote those words in my mind and kept my face still. Then Peter stood. He did not shout. He said Ava had lived with me since birth. Ryan had been absent for nearly 4 years by choice, and Susan's financial control looked less like support and more like coercion. He said the alleged affair did not erase primary caregiving. Ryan looked bored. Then Peter said, "The petitioner has also made repeated claims regarding the respondent's residence that are materially false." Ryan's attorney frowned. Susan stopped touching her pearls. Peter handed the judge a certified copy of the trust memorandum and the recorded deed history. Not all of it, just enough. The judge adjusted her glasses. For a few seconds, nobody spoke. Then she asked Ryan's attorney if he had reviewed title to the home before representing to the court that it belonged to Ryan's family. He glanced at Ryan. Ryan looked at his father. His father looked down at his hands. That silence was the first crack in their wall. Peter said, "Your Honor, the respondent is not living in the petitioner's family property. The recorded instruments show she may be the legal claimant to the residence and the commercial property." Susan whispered, "No." It was small, but I heard it. The judge heard it too. Peter said we were not asking family court to decide the property issue. We were asking the court not to base custody on a lie. Ryan's attorney asked for a recess. The judge gave him 10 minutes. The hallway afterward felt like a storm trapped inside a building. Ryan came toward me so fast, Peter stepped in front of him. Susan followed, her face pale under her makeup. "What did you do?" Ryan said. I said, "I found my father's papers." His father made a sound like air leaving a tire. Susan pointed at me. "You have no idea what those mean." Peter said, "Then you can explain that in the property case." Ryan's eyes moved between me and his father. For the first time in all the years I had known him, he looked less angry than confused. He lowered his voice and said, "You should have come to me." I almost did laugh then. I said, Like you came to me before bringing Naomi into my marriage?" Naomi stood near the vending machines, frozen. Susan snapped, "Do not drag that poor girl into your disgrace." The words left my mouth before I could polish them. "You dragged her here to watch you take my child." A couple sitting on the bench turned to look. Susan noticed. Her lips pressed together. The second half of the hearing went differently. Ryan's attorney stopped sounding confident. The judge ordered that Ava remain with me pending further review. Ryan received scheduled visitation, but only locally, and Susan was not allowed to remove Ava from my care without written agreement. It was not victory yet. But when Susan walked out of that courtroom, she was not walking ahead of me anymore. She was walking beside a son who had just learned his roof was not his roof. The real reversal happened 3 weeks later at the county recorder's office. Peter had requested a public records review because Ryan's father challenged the trust. By then, word had moved through town in that strange, quiet way small towns spread scandal. People did not say much to my face, but I could feel them watching differently. Not kinder exactly, just less certain. The meeting was held in a plain county conference room with beige walls and a long table that looked like it had hosted 1,000 arguments. Peter, Ryan, Susan, Ryan's father, their attorney, a county records supervisor, and I sat under buzzing fluorescent lights. Ryan did not bring Naomi that time. Susan wore black, as if someone had died. In a way, something had. Their attorney tried to frame the issue as an old misunderstanding. He said my father had intended to sell, the families had been close, and paperwork was imperfect in small communities. Peter let him speak. Then he placed the enlarged signature pages on the table. My father's real signature was on the left. The alleged lease extension was on the right. Beside them was a letter my father had written before he died, saying he had secured the Cedar Avenue property so Emily would always have something no one could take from her. I had never seen that letter before that morning. When Peter read that line aloud, my eyes filled so fast the room blurred. Susan looked away. Peter then played the voicemail Ryan had left after the hearing. His voice came through the speaker, cold and clear. "You think a piece of paper makes you powerful? I can still make sure Ava knows exactly what kind of woman you are." Nobody moved. Then Peter played Susan's porch threat from the day Mrs. Larkin stood outside. I had recorded it on my phone after she said she would call the sheriff. Her voice filled the room, polished and cruel. "Fight me here, and I will call the sheriff. Then everyone will see what kind of mother you are." Susan's attorney closed his eyes. That was the moment I saw her understand. Not the property, not the money, the audience. For years, Susan had survived by choosing the room before she chose the lie. She knew when to whisper, when to smile, when to sound concerned, when to make cruelty look like family duty. But that day, the room had been chosen for her. Peter turned to Ryan's father and said, "Did you sign the original agreement acknowledging Emily's father retained ownership of the land?" The old man's mouth opened. Susan answered for him. "He does not need to respond to that." Peter looked at the supervisor, then back at him. "He will need to respond somewhere." Ryan slammed his hand on the table and said, "Enough. We built that business." I looked at him then. "You built it on land you told me I should be grateful to sleep on." His face changed. I kept going because stopping would have killed me. "You told me to remember whose roof I was under. Your mother called me a charity case in my own kitchen. You filed papers saying I had no home, no money, and no standing. But the house was mine. The land was mine. And your family knew before you married me." Ryan looked at his father again. That was the ugliest part for him, I think. Not losing to me. Realizing someone above him had kept him ignorant too. Susan said my name like a warning. I turned to her. "No. You do not get to say my name like you own it anymore." For a second, the room went completely still. Then Ryan's father began to cry. He covered his face with both hands and said he had meant to fix it after my father died. He said the store was struggling. He said Susan told him no one would ever understand the old papers. He said they were going to make it right once business improved. Susan hissed, "Stop talking." But he had already opened the door. He admitted enough that their attorney asked to pause the meeting. Peter did not object. He did not need to. The damage was sitting on the table with signatures, recordings, and a dead man's letter. 2 months later, the settlement conference was held at the courthouse. By then, Ryan's family had 3 problems: the property case, the custody case, and a possible fraud referral Peter had not even needed to push hard because the county records supervisor had done it for him. Their market had been temporarily restricted from refinancing or selling. Their bank froze the expansion loan Ryan had come home bragging about. Vendors started asking questions. People who used to praise Susan for being generous stopped inviting her to lead committees. That was her real punishment at first. Being seen. At the settlement conference, Ryan looked exhausted. Naomi had left town the week before. I did not celebrate it. Naomi had not broken my life. She had simply walked into a room Ryan had lied about. Susan still tried to perform. She told the mediator that she only wanted what was best for Ava. She said I had made mistakes. She said nobody was perfect. She said family should not be destroyed over old paperwork. I listened until she said family. Then I put the deed copy on the table. I said, "You destroyed family when you used my daughter to punish me." The mediator did not interrupt, so I kept going. I said I would not force the market to close immediately if they signed a real lease at market rent, paid part of the unpaid lease debt into Ava's education trust, withdrew every false claim about me, and agreed to a custody order naming me Ava's primary residential parent. Susan would have no unsupervised authority over Ava. Ryan stared at me. Susan said, "You cannot dictate terms to us." Peter slid the fraud file forward without opening it. I said, "I can choose whether this stays civil." That was the first time in my life I watched Susan run out of words. The custody order was signed before the property settlement. I remember the pen more than the paper. Black ink, silver clip, heavy in my hand. Ryan signed first. He did not look at me. Susan sat behind him, rigid, her face empty. The judge reviewed the agreement and asked both of us if we understood. Ryan said yes. I said yes, but my voice almost broke because Ava was sitting outside with my sister, coloring in a book, unaware that a few signatures were changing the shape of her childhood. When we walked out, Ryan stopped me near the courthouse steps. For a moment, he looked like the young man from the street fair, the one who had told me he was afraid I would reject him. Then his face hardened again, because pride had always been faster than truth. He said, "You think this makes you a good mother?" I looked at him for a long second. "No," I said. "Ava does." He flinched like I had slapped him. I did not stay to see what he did with that. Ava came home with me that night, really home, not the temporary kind that depended on Susan's mood. She ran ahead of me through the front door and stopped in the living room, looking around like the house had changed. Maybe it had. Maybe walls know when fear leaves. She asked if Grandma was mad. I told her Grandma was dealing with grown-up consequences. Ava thought about that and asked if grown-up consequences were like timeout. I said sometimes they were bigger. She nodded seriously, then asked if we could make pancakes for dinner. So we did. A week later, Susan came to the house one last time without calling. She did not use her key. She could not. Peter had changed the locks, and I had mailed her old key back in a padded envelope with no note. She stood on the porch in a beige coat, looking smaller than I had ever seen her. I opened the door but kept the screen locked. She looked past me into the house. I raised my granddaughter too, I said. You controlled her. Her mouth trembled. You would have been nothing without this family. I almost smiled. You lived in my father's mercy and called it yours, I said. So it must be humiliating to rent from nothing. Susan's face changed in a way I will never forget. For years, she had used humiliation like a household tool. That day, one clean piece of it came back. She left without saying goodbye. The market stayed open, but the sign changed 6 months later. Ryan's father retired. Ryan took a job with a distributor in Portland after the bank refused to finance his expansion. Susan stopped appearing in the front window greeting customers like she owned the whole street. But every month, a rent check came to a property account with my name on it. The first time I saw one, I sat at my kitchen table and cried. Not because of the money, because of the line on the memo, Cedar Avenue lease. The same avenue where I had been told to be grateful. The same land where I had been watched, judged, threatened, and nearly erased. My father had left me a way out before I even knew I would need one. Cole and I did not become some perfect love story after that. Real life is not that clean. We had hurt people, and I needed to rebuild a life that belonged to me before I decided whether anyone else belonged in it. A year later, we had coffee. 3 years later, we married quietly in my mother's backyard with Ava holding the flowers. Later, we had a son, Noah, and Ava adored him from the start. Ryan remained in Ava's life, but he never controlled mine again. He learned to ask for schedule changes in writing. He learned not to send Susan to speak for him. He learned I was not the same woman he left begging in the hallway. Years later, when Ava was 15, she asked me what really happened. She had my father's letter in her hand, and after reading the line about him wanting me to always have something no one could take, she asked why nobody told me sooner. I told her some people hide what belongs to you because they know you might stand taller if you find it. Then she asked if I regretted fighting. I thought of Susan saying girls like me did not get choices. I thought of Ryan reaching for Ava's wrist. I thought of Susan hearing her own threat played back in that county conference room. No, I said. I regret waiting so long to believe I was allowed to fight. I told Ava to keep the letter. It was always meant to protect us, I said. Now you know. That night, after the kids went to bed, I stood alone in the kitchen of the little white house. The countertops were newer. The cabinets were repainted. The locks were mine. The silence was mine too, and it did not scare me anymore. For years, they had told me I was living under their roof, but the truth had been under my feet the whole time. What would you do in this situation? Be honest. Or did this remind you of someone? Tell me in the comments. And if this made you think about your own relationship, I left something in the description that can help you build something stronger. Subscribe if you want more stories like this every day, and share this with someone who needs to hear this story.